For centuries and longer, rats have fought tirelessly to repel the incessant frog invasions. Peace was only ever short-lived.
For a while now, I've been racking my brain trying to think of the best way to describe Tales of Iron. And sure, I could list off the numerous inspirations and influences that it draws from, but I figured that this image I made about sums it up best. The TLD of the story is pretty straightforward, with you playing as Reggie, the smallest prince rat and heir to the throne, who fights your elder brother Dennis for the right to rule, only to have your coronation get interrupted and your kingdom ransacked by a bunch of bloodthirsty lads from the Frog Clan. Understandably, Tales of Iron revolves around fending off these invading frogs in a 2D action RPG, while exploring with some Castlevania elements and ultimately seeking to restore your kingdom to its former glory. All the while having Reggie's life story narrated by Geralt of Rivia.
So it was decided. The crown should pass to Whiskers New.
This would explain where the voice acting budget went, considering it sounds like the rest of the cast has swallowed slide whistles. No joke, this is actually how everybody sounds. According to the Steam blurb, the art style is deceptively charming, which is pretty accurate considering it may look all cutesy with its hand-drawn looking kinda art style, but then you'll be bisecting frogs and getting covered in gore that glows in the dark. At first glance, the game may look like it's aimed towards kids, but when you see some of the executions Reggie does and how he revels in murder like it's Miami Connection, it can be surprisingly brutal. That being said, the art style is actually pretty beautiful and the layered backgrounds are really pleasing to look at, along with having lots of intricate details scattered throughout the levels, with some locations noticeably changing whenever you revisit them while the story unfolds. As of the latest update, you've got 3 difficulty modes to pick from, albeit being plenty tough enough as it is on standard. You've got your normal attacks, then you can hold down to do a power move, and later on you receive both a ranged option with limited ammunition, as well as a heavy weapon to break down both enemies' guards and barricades alike. There's 3 variations of melee weapons with their own independent movesets for axes, spears, and swords, each having their own slight benefits and drawbacks, like spears struggling against airborne targets due to its thrust rather than the slash attacks for the other 2, for example. This difference in combat style also extends to the ranged weapons, with different ammo amounts and serving different functions, like the crossbow not being very good at aiming up for starters. You can block and parry some normal attacks, as well as the telegraphed yellow ones, whilst you otherwise have to dodge past or get out of the way of red attacks. It's pretty simplistic in principle, but can get a little frantic and hectic when facing off against multiple enemies at once and having to juggle them all at the same time. Considering how tough each and every fight can be, especially starting out when you're poorly equipped and enemies deal chunks of damage at a time, you could thankfully refill your health pretty quickly and in measured gulps by downing bug juice. And while dispensers will let you top off your supply fully, they're not too abundant, so you'll have to rely on nicking it from fallen frogs or even draining the blood of your enemies to keep you going. Since simply parking your rat arse on a bench isn't enough to heal, instead only serving to save your progress. I have to say that the enemy designs are pretty cool and appropriately silly for the cutesy storybook setting they've got going, with pretty dumb names like Blocky Magoo, and the non-frog enemies can be kind of gross, like the Bug Queen and her choice of attacks, for example. Even the way that enemies are introduced can be pretty cool additions, having them lurking in the background of stages as you draw nearer to their lairs and so on. It makes for a nice little attention to detail, as well as adding to the background storytelling they've got going on as a whole. Suffice to say, it can even get a little spooky once you're exploring the crypts and discover undead rat boys wandering around. They look downright awesome, and appropriately fall to pieces the more you wail on them. Even that won't stop them though, as they'll crawl after you despite having no leg to stand on. What's worse is there isn't any specialized defense against these guys, so they can be pretty strong for nothing but a bunch of bone and ligaments. They're definitely my favorite enemy type in the game, from how tenacious they are, as well as their design simply being badass. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, the only design I actively disliked would have to be the jetpack frogs introduced very late into Tales of Iron. They felt like a step too far in how silly they'd come across, as well as actively clashing with the art style as a whole, making them look kind of out of place. Granted, they only show up towards the very end of the game, but they're also kind of annoying to fight too, which is a shame given how prominently they feature in numbers by then. A few other problems I encountered include certain hitboxes of enemies lingering longer than they really ought to, especially boss fights. Then a lot of times I get benched from a boss spamming some ass slam attack and stun locking me in place since there's no iframes, meaning I have no choice but to sit there and take it as I go from full health to dead. That, or other times I'd roll into a yellow attack the very moment they start charging it, which can be a bit frustrating. Besides these few instances though, the combat works as intended, and it doesn't detract from the satisfaction you feel after overcoming some boss that's been giving you grief. Although it's not quite as satisfying when the boss's AI bugs out and runs in place. Granted, this only happened one time, but it was still really bizarre. Outside of these few select problem areas, the combat overall is a lot of fun and very fluid, visceral, and engaging, so when it works, it really does work in Tales of Iron's favor. To help you stand a better chance against your enemies, you're able to kit out your royal rat with all sorts of armors, helmets, and weapons, each of varying rarities, power, and weight, ranging from featherlight, allowing you to dash and dodge at your fullest potential, or bulking up to the point of fat rolling around whilst tanking fat damage. Move speed also varies depending on having your weapon drawn, so no, you don't run faster with the knife in this case, unfortunately. I personally enjoy all the animations they included for movement, like climbing, and especially the cute little skittering hop run Reggie does while getting around. The actual act of going from one place to another doesn't really evolve much, however. You can slide down walls and jump off of surfaces from the get-go, so besides obtaining the heavy weapon to break down barricades, there isn't much progression in the way of methods to open up new paths or find ways to explore. Not to mention that barricades for some reason keep respawning every time you come back, so you have to waste time smashing them again. Which, while it doesn't take too long, it can still be kind of annoying when you have to do it over and over whenever you fail to beat a boss and have to run back. The activation zone for some stuff can also be very precise, like accessing your storage or trying to climb down ledges that can be a little finicky at times. That isn't to say that it isn't rewarding or fun in its own right to explore, more so that for a Castlevania, there isn't much in the way of upgrading your moveset or acquiring items to access new areas. Outside of gaining an item that lets you navigate toxic gas-filled tunnels, there really isn't much to look forward to, which is a shame. At the very least, the levels you go exploring are very pretty and have some branching paths for you to explore and get lost in, sometimes even having means of looping back around and opening up shortcuts, as well as having a couple of optional side areas. Each zone can also feel very distinct from one another, having different ambience and music to help them stand out more. Some of which even change over time as you revisit locations, like the Crimson Keep and town both being rebuilt, forever showcasing the results of your efforts in restoring the kingdom. The sound design as a whole is very good too, having weapons sound impactful during combat or the little tip-taps of your toes as you're running around, along with having both enemies and a bard rat jamming out while facing some of the bosses, making the encounters that much more memorable and enjoyable. Throughout your journey, there's 3 separate currencies for Reggie to collect in the form of bits, iron, and gold. These first 2 are easy to come by to the point that I was pretty much topped up on them at 99% of the game. They're used to purchase some stuff from the store, like deeds and unlock new weapons and armor or upgrade your pre-existing ones. Otherwise, you mainly use them to refill your stockpile of poisons or ranged ammo, but that's about it, and even then you can find free ways of doing that. I definitely think they should have included more means of spending options for it, since it otherwise just sat at 99 the whole game. On the other hand, gold is essential to restoring your Crimson Keep in order to advance the plot, which granted does tie in with the background and atmospheric storytelling I mentioned earlier as you go back and forth between Tailtown and the Keep, witnessing both locations being rebuilt, which is a nice touch for sure, but unfortunately this ties in with the busy work that the game has you do early on until about the midsection of the game, wherein the elders or rangers have you pick up missions from a bounty board and go slay X number of grubs or frogs in a few select areas. On the plus side, the fights it has you doing can be pretty interesting against certain bosses and enemies, but the game recycles the same few locations, primarily in the sewers, that make it feel a bit tedious and come across as needless padding as a result. I wouldn't have minded this so much if they simply had you going somewhere else instead of trekking the same path over and over again. Speaking of the upgrades, the Forge seems to be entirely RNG on what you'll get for each deed, as far as I could tell anyway, which can be good or bad depending on what it gives you, since it'll have you comparing and experimenting with different weapons, but it may take some time before it gives you something you actually wanted. While you're at it, you may want to do a little pre-planning before you go trotting off to war too, since different armors can offer specific racial defenses in addition to general defense that encompasses everything. So it may be worth considering throwing on a little extra weight if it means you won't be getting too shot by some Randy J bugs along the way. Throughout the story, you'll also come across some NPCs who will join you as temporary companions. While that's very nice of them to join me for certain sections, they unfortunately sit in the back and don't really do anything to contribute. Dennis is by far and away the most useless since he's melee, meaning he'll swing once in a blue moon, usually missing whatever he was attacking in the first place, then stand around doing nothing for the next 30 seconds. He doesn't even tank for you, serving practically no use other than just inflate the number of enemies you're fighting by yourself. At the very least, they're invincible, so they're not an escort quest that you have to babysit. And range NPCs can actually hit something, with Jay in particular helping out by virtue of gun. This, plus coming with his own fat beatsies, makes him the best companion a comrade could ever ask for. With everything said and done, and without getting into anything too specifically spoiler heavy in terms of the story, there is a pretty drastic tonal shift about halfway through the game that may prove to turn some people off. I was personally a little leery about it at first, but it quickly grew on me after some time to adjust. The pacing can suffer a little bit because of this, where up until now you've been doing the same back and forth side quest to restore your keep, then you come to this area, and right after that it feels like the game is trying to rush you through the rest of the story a little bit. It's not bad, so much as a bit bumpy and could have used some more smoothing out in places. When the new areas and set pieces and the main story itself gets going, it does pick up quite a lot, but it takes some dragging your little rat feet to get there in some cases. Otherwise, Tales of Iron as a whole is a very fun and enjoyable game. The combat is fast, intense, and satisfying, whenever you're not getting stun locked in place and have a half-decent weapon so enemies aren't just health sponges at the start. The exploration is pretty decent, even if it has you revisiting the same few places a few times too many, and the variety of foes to overcome are diverse enough to keep things engaging and interesting. All of this, plus the gorgeous art style and cutesy setting, make for a genuinely great experience that I thoroughly enjoyed. It's a really good 6 to 8 hour experience that I can recommend people trying out. Oddbug Studio did a good job with Tales of Iron, and I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. As always, cheers for sticking around, and I'll see you all next time, where we'll be discovering whatever did happen to Atlantis in an old school adventure. Until then, keep on smiling, and I'll see you next time.